For an African to visit a European nation, an ordinary African, to visit a European nation is like, let me give you an example my teacher used to use. It's like trying to milk an elephant because of the visa process. However, for a European to visit an African nation, most of our nations, it is like a walk on the beach. It's like going to have a cup of tea.
The solution is not to take...
...are being pushed out of West and Central Africa as other world players gain influence there. That's the message from the EU's Military Staff Director General, who's raised concerns over Europe potentially losing access to the continent's resources.
We are more or less pushed out many Western countries, including US, from Niger, from Mali, from Burkina Faso, from
where you might
rivals. Our union stood on a stage, making grand promises to the world. We are cutting off Russian energy, they said. We stand united. But behind the curtain, a secret ledger was being written, and the numbers in that ledger tell a completely different story. While the EU as a whole has reduced its reliance, 7 member states have secretly, or not so secretly, been moving in the opposite direction. And the increase...
Europe has responded just enough to survive, just enough to get by, without fixing the deep structural problems that make the euro vulnerable in the first place. And right now, those vulnerabilities are piling up. As the EU continues to militarize and to cut social spending programs in favor of new bunkers and more weapons, it is clearly on a downward spiral.
Today is not only a major power, it is the #1 country in more industries and technologies than most people realize. While many still think of China as just the world's factory, the truth is that it has already become the global leader in the industries that define the future. Let's explore 10 things that China leads the world in today, starting from number 10 all the way to number 1.
Economy, indebted, low growth, loss of trust. Let's now look at the kind of attraction of the populace. And it starts with that sense of completely turning a new page, I think. So the questions I have, the first question I have about them is...
On my first point, energy and climate. Today, only 2% of global investments in clean energy go to Africa. This is sobering. This is very sobering, given Africa's immense potential as a clean energy powerhouse. Africa has the space, the wind, the sun, just to name a few. What it lacks is infrastructure. But together, we can change this. With Global Gateway, we aim to bring clean energy to 100 million people who currently don't have access to energy. This can turn out as a double win. Africa can not only produce enough clean energy to power up the African continent, but also to create revenues by exporting. Preparations have begun, for example, to build the first underwater electricity cable linking North Africa to Italy and the rest of Europe. And, for example, our new hydrogen bank is now open to African producers. This means good jobs, energy security for both Africa and Europe.
The announcement of the Africa-China $500 billion trade pact sent tremors through Europe's financial capitals. For decades, European economies had relied on Africa as both a source of raw materials and a guaranteed market for finished goods. But the new agreement marked a decisive break from that dependency, signed quietly, but executed swiftly. The pact created the largest transcontinental trade framework outside Western control. And within months, it began to shift global trade balances in ways few in Brussels, Berlin, or Paris could have anticipated. At its core, the deal was about sovereignty and strategy. China pledged $500 billion in long-term investments spread across 45 African nations, targeting infrastructure, manufacturing, and technology sectors. But unlike past agreements that tied African economies to debt, this one emphasized production, ownership, and mutual profit. African leaders had learned from history. This was not a new colonial arrangement, but a partnership designed to transform the continent from a supplier into a manufacturer. In Beijing's calculations, Africa was not just a resource hub, it was the future factory of the world. European economists immediately understood the implications. For centuries, Europe had extracted wealth from Africa through trade terms that favored its industries. Europe's factories produced the cars, machinery, and consumer goods, while Africa exported cocoa, oil, minerals, and labor. But under the new pact, the balance reversed. African nations, supported by Chinese capital and expertise, began building processing plants, assembly lines, and logistics hubs. Copper from Zambia, once shipped to Europe, was now being refined locally. Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya began producing components for solar panels and electric vehicles, goods once imported from Europe. In London, the stock market reacted first. Shares of European manufacturing companies tied to African imports plunged. Commodity prices fluctuated as traders realized Europe's access to key materials like cobalt, lithium, and rare earth metals could no longer be taken for granted. By the end of the first quarter, analysts were calling it the most significant shift in global trade dynamics since the end of the Cold War. The European Central Bank convened emergency meetings as the euro began to weaken against the yuan and several African currencies. What shocked European policymakers most was Africa's speed. Within 6 months, ports from Mombasa to Dakar were upgraded through Chinese-funded smart logistics systems that tripled export efficiency. Railway networks connected resource regions to industrial zones, creating seamless trade corridors. The Suez and Djibouti routes, once dominated by European fleets, now saw a surge in Chinese and African shipping companies controlling 65% of trade volume. Africa's own regional digital payment system, backed by Beijing, began bypassing Western banking networks, reducing dependence on the dollar and euro. The psychological blow to Europe was just as severe as the economic one. For generations, Europe had positioned itself as Africa's development partner. Aid programs, cultural missions, and policy dialogues had projected an image of mutual cooperation. But beneath that facade was a deeply unequal relationship. The $500 billion trade pact exposed that imbalance. Europe suddenly looked outdated, a continent of aging industries and declining influence trying to lecture a younger, more dynamic one. Paris and Berlin scrambled to respond. Officials proposed an Africa-Europe renewal plan, promising $100 billion in new investments and partnerships focused on renewable energy and green technology. But by then, the momentum had shifted. African nations no longer viewed Europe as their first choice. China's approach, infrastructure for trade, technology for value creation, and respect for sovereignty had resonated. In return, Beijing gained something priceless: loyalty and access. For Africa, the partnership meant more than just money. It symbolized a continental awakening. The pact encouraged local innovation, leading to the rise of African-made brands and startups that began competing globally. In Johannesburg and Lagos, trade summits attracted Asian investors eager to fund agriculture, fintech, and manufacturing ventures. Even smaller nations like Rwanda and Botswana positioned themselves as digital service hubs. The effect was explosive. For the first time in history, Africa's combined GDP growth surpassed that of the European Union. Meanwhile, European industries faced an identity crisis. The manufacturing giants of Germany saw orders from African nations decline sharply as new factories in Ethiopia, Egypt, and Morocco began supplying regional markets. Italian textile producers lost contracts to African clothing brands using locally sourced materials. France's agricultural exports suffered as African agritech cooperatives expanded into domestic food processing and exports. The continent that Europe once lectured on development was now teaching efficiency. In Brussels, debates turned bitter. Some politicians blamed the crisis on decades of arrogance, Europe's failure to treat Africa as an equal. Others argued that the West had become too dependent on global supply chains it no longer controlled. Across the continent, energy prices rose as African nations began renegotiating terms on uranium and oil exports. The French energy sector, once heavily reliant on Niger's uranium mines, faced shortages after new African-Asian energy alliances redirected supplies eastward. The shift rippled into the political arena. European voters, facing rising unemployment and inflation, began questioning their government's foreign policies. Populist parties capitalized on the fear, claiming Europe had lost its place in the world. Meanwhile, Africa was experiencing its own version of the Industrial Revolution. African universities partnered with Chinese institutions to create research centers focused on robotics, biotechnology, and sustainable agriculture. African currencies stabilized as trade became less dependent on Western markets, and digital currencies, backed by natural resources, began circulating across borders. The Western media narrative struggled to keep up. headlines described the trade pact as a silent earthquake or the end of Western economic dominance. Yet on the ground, in cities like Nairobi, Accra, and Cairo, the atmosphere was one of optimism. Roads were expanding, power grids improving, and technology hubs multiplying. A new generation of African professionals, engineers, economists, designers was leading the transformation. European corporations tried to adapt, seeking joint ventures with African and Chinese firms, but they found the rules had changed. No longer could they dictate contracts or secure exclusive rights. African governments, emboldened by the Pact, demanded fair pricing, local employment, and technology transfer. Some European investors withdrew altogether, unable to compete under the new conditions. Others reluctantly complied, acknowledging that the age of Western privilege was over. By the end of the first year, Europe's dependence on African exports had become a vulnerability. Trade deficits widened, and industries from automobiles to electronics reported supply chain disruptions. Economists described Europe as being brought to its knees not by war or crisis, but by a new global logic. Africa had turned from a dependent region into an indispensable power, and China had positioned itself at the center of that transformation. The symbolic image that dominated headlines was that of a container ship bearing both African and Chinese flags, docking at a newly expanded port in Tanzania. The vessel was loaded with finished goods, not raw materials destined for Asia and South America. It was a visual reminder that the world order had changed. Africa was no longer a warehouse for the West's consumption, it had become a cornerstone of the future global economy. Europe, watching from afar, could no longer deny what had happened. The continent that once shaped Africa's destiny was now being reshaped by Africa's decisions. And for the first time in centuries, it was Europe, not Africa, struggling to find its place in a new world. As the Africa-China $500 billion trade pact deepened, the economic tremors that began in Europe evolved into a full-scale geopolitical crisis. What started as a regional trade agreement had quickly transformed into a global power shift. The Western world, particularly Europe, found itself sidelined as African nations asserted a new kind of independence, one that merged commerce, infrastructure, and diplomacy into a unified force. The balance of global influence, once comfortably resting in Western capitals, now tilted toward the East and the global South. The backbone of this transformation lay in the structure of the trade pact itself. Unlike previous Western-dominated models that came with political strings attached, the Africa-China deal emphasized equality, production, and shared prosperity. Africa provided the land, resources, and youthful labor force. China brought the financing, engineering expertise, and technology. Together, they created a model of trade that was pragmatic, results-oriented, and fiercely competitive. It was not a charity model, it was business on Africa's terms. Within a year, Africa's industrial landscape had begun to transform. Massive industrial parks sprang up across multiple regions. Ghana and Kenya emerged as centers for automobile assembly and electric vehicle battery production. Ethiopia and Egypt became manufacturing powerhouses for consumer electronics, while Nigeria, Angola, and Mozambique led the new wave of energy processing and petrochemical development. China's Belt and Road Initiative seamlessly integrated with Africa's continental free trade area, creating an economic web stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic. Goods, data, and investments now moved across borders with a speed and efficiency unseen in African history. Europe, meanwhile, struggled to adjust to the new realities. Its trade surpluses began to vanish as Africa reduced imports of European goods. Previously, European farmers relied on African markets for dairy, grains, and wine exports, but African agribusiness, now supported by Chinese mechanization and logistics systems, began producing and exporting their own products. European companies that once dominated African telecommunications and energy sectors found themselves edged out by joint African-Chinese ventures offering cheaper, faster, and more reliable services. Politically, this shift was devastating for Europe. The old strategy of maintaining influence through development aid and humanitarian partnerships had collapsed. African leaders no longer needed to negotiate with Brussels or Paris for assistance. They had options, leverage, and confidence. In international forums, African diplomats began advocating for new trade systems that prioritized South-South cooperation, bypassing Western intermediaries. When the World Trade Organization held its next summit, African nations, backed by China and other Asian economies, successfully pushed for reforms that reduced European subsidies and gave emerging markets greater say in global trade rules. The psychological impact of this victory rippled far beyond trade policy. It was symbolic, a declaration that Africa was no longer a junior partner in global affairs. European commentators described the moment as a reversal of 5 centuries of economic hierarchy. The pride sweeping across African cities was palpable. News outlets across the continent celebrated the deal as the dawn of an African economic renaissance, comparing it to Europe's industrial revolution, but this time led from the equator, not the north. Yet, beneath this optimism, Washington and Brussels grew increasingly alarmed. Intelligence reports indicated that Africa's resource exports to Europe had declined by 45% in just 18 months, while exports to China had doubled. Even more concerning for Western policymakers was the rise of African technological independence. African software engineers, trained through joint programs with Chinese universities, were developing their own operating systems, digital currencies, and AI-driven logistics systems. The need for Western intellectual property was fading. The United States tried to counter the shift with promises of renewed engagement. High-level delegations visited African capitals, offering loans, investment funds, and new trade partnerships. But African nations, weary of past conditions tied to Western funding, received the proposals with polite indifference. The continent's policymakers had learned that dependency often came disguised as aid. In contrast, the new model of cooperation with Asia prioritized ownership and profit sharing. African nations no longer wanted to be consumers of global goods, they wanted to be producers, innovators, and exporters. Europe's panic deepened when Africa announced the Continental Value Chain Initiative, a program that required all foreign investors to process at least 60% of African raw materials locally before export. This effectively dismantled the long-standing Western strategy of importing Africa's resources cheaply and selling them back as finished products. Factories in Berlin and Lyon that relied on raw cobalt, copper, and manganese suddenly faced shortages. African ports, once crowded with ships carrying raw exports to Europe, now handled shipments of finished goods headed for Asia and South America. In response, European media launched an aggressive campaign accusing China of economic colonization. However, this narrative failed to resonate in Africa, where the results of the partnership were visible and tangible: new railways, hospitals, industrial parks, and digital infrastructure. For ordinary Africans, what mattered was progress, not rhetoric. The idea of partnership, not dependency, had become central to the continent's identity. As months passed, Africa's growing influence began reshaping the financial system as well. Several African nations started using a new cross-border payment platform linked to China's digital currency network, significantly reducing reliance on the US dollar and euro. The global financial markets took notice. The dollar's dominance in African trade transactions dropped by nearly 30% in a single year. Analysts warned that this could mark the beginning of a de-dollarization wave, as Africa and Asia created new financial ecosystems immune to Western sanctions or manipulation. Meanwhile, the European Union faced internal divisions. Some member states argued for re-engagement with Africa through fairer trade terms, while others wanted protectionist measures to defend European industries. Tensions rose as unemployment rates increased and public confidence in European leadership plummeted. For the first time, Europe found itself debating how to catch up to Africa, a stunning reversal of history. In African capitals, the tone was different. Leaders spoke confidently about a new era of equality in global trade. The media celebrated Africa's transformation from a continent of potential to a continent of power. The $500 billion trade pact was more than an agreement. It was a symbol of strategic maturity, Africa learning to play the global game and win. By the end of the second year, Europe's exports to Africa had fallen to their lowest level in decades, while African exports to Asia surged beyond projections. The continent's economic growth outpaced global averages, driven by industrialization, innovation, and infrastructure. Even skeptics admitted that the balance of power had shifted. The old narrative that Africa needed saving had finally collapsed. Now it was Europe searching for salvation and Africa holding the blueprint. The aftershocks of the Africa-China $500 billion trade pact were no longer just economic, they were cultural, political, and deeply psychological. Across the globe, it had become impossible to ignore one truth: Africa had arrived. The continent, once dismissed as a passive player in global commerce, was now setting the pace of the New World Order. Europe, still reeling from industrial slowdowns and shrinking export markets, found itself increasingly dependent on the very continent it once viewed as an economic appendage. As the new trade networks matured, African economies began coordinating in ways the world had never seen before. The African Continental Free Trade Area integrated seamlessly with Chinese supply chains, creating an efficient system where goods moved from production zones in Kenya to shipping ports in Tanzania and manufacturing hubs in Egypt with minimal delay. Advanced logistics systems powered by artificial intelligence optimized cargo routes, reducing costs and increasing efficiency. Africa was no longer just exporting raw materials, it was exporting finished products, branded proudly with Made in Africa. In the energy sector, African nations expanded their renewable power grids with Chinese technology. Solar fields in the Sahara and hydroelectric dams along the Congo River powered industrial plants that produced batteries, semiconductors, and electric vehicles. These goods no longer flowed to Europe or America but to the vast Asian markets hungry for affordable, sustainable products. The once dominant Western companies found themselves losing market share, unable to compete with Africa's new production ecosystem that offered high quality at low costs. Europe's frustration turned into desperation. Leaders in Brussels convened multiple summits to discuss how to re-engage Africa, but their proposals seemed outdated. The era of one-sided deals was over. African policymakers made it clear that the continent would only engage under terms that guaranteed equality, technology transfer, and shared profits. This new confidence was reinforced by the rapid growth of African stock markets, digital currencies, and cross-border fintech systems that rivaled Western financial platforms. At the same time, Western media began portraying Africa as a strategic threat, a continent being captured by China. Yet on the ground, Africans viewed the partnership as liberation from decades of economic dependency. The roads, ports, and factories that dotted the continent were not symbols of colonization, but of capability. In the eyes of African citizens, this alliance was not about choosing sides, it was about choosing dignity. In several European capitals, the economic pain was evident. Manufacturing industries in Germany and Italy suffered from shortages of raw materials like cobalt, lithium, and manganese, resources now prioritized for processing within Africa. Energy companies in France faced skyrocketing prices after African nations renegotiated oil and gas contracts to favor local refining. Agricultural exports from Europe also declined as African nations, supported by Chinese mechanization, expanded food production to feed their populations and export surpluses to Asia. Washington and Brussels launched emergency economic initiatives, but it was too late. The foundation of global trade had shifted. Africa had become the new frontier not of exploitation, but of innovation and influence. Investors from South America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia poured into African markets, seeking joint ventures in technology, logistics, and manufacturing. The continent's young population, educated and digitally connected, embraced the transformation with energy and creativity. In global summits, Africa's representatives spoke with authority, no longer pleading for inclusion but shaping agendas. When a major international forum was held to discuss the future of global supply chains, African delegates proposed a new framework that emphasized fair resource utilization, environmental protection, and technology equity. The proposal gained immediate support from Asia and parts of Latin America, while Europe hesitated, realizing it no longer held the moral or economic leverage to dictate global policy. The psychological reversal was historic. For centuries, Africa had been treated as a periphery in the global system, a place to extract from, not invest in. Now, the periphery had become the pivot. The transformation was not just about money. It was about mindset. African leaders had learned to negotiate from a position of strength, recognizing that the world's transition to renewable energy, electric vehicles, and digital economies depended on resources buried beneath African soil. The world's future was literally built on Africa's ground. Meanwhile, across Europe, political divisions deepened. Protests erupted as unemployment soared, especially in industries dependent on African imports. Economists warned that Europe was entering a lost decade unless it restructured its economic relationships. Yet even as they debated, Africa's momentum continued. New partnerships with Asian financial institutions replaced old Western loans. Digital infrastructure spread across the continent, connecting markets from Lagos to Nairobi in seconds. Culturally, the shift resonated deeply. African media outlets, filmmakers, and influencers began telling stories of success, resilience, and innovation. The world was listening. Global audiences were fascinated by Africa's rebirth, a narrative of progress that contrasted sharply with Europe's tales of stagnation and crisis. African cities became centers of innovation and culture, drawing global entrepreneurs who saw in Africa what they once saw in Silicon Valley: potential without limits. By the third year of the Pact, the data was undeniable. Africa's GDP growth outpaced global averages, Foreign investment flows were at record highs, and its intracontinental trade volumes had doubled. Europe's trade share with Africa dropped below 10%, a level unseen in modern history. Analysts called it the age of reversal, the first time the economic tide had decisively turned in Africa's favor. What began as a simple trade agreement had become a revolution not through war or protest, but through economic intelligence and cooperation. The alliance with China had not enslaved Africa. It had awakened it. The continent had finally leveraged its resources, people, and potential to claim its rightful place in the world economy. For Europe, the lesson was painful but clear. The age of dominance was over. For Africa, it was the beginning of a new era, one defined not by aid or dependence, but by partnership, production, and power.